He saw her standing there, shackled like the rest of them, head bowed, but not in submission. No, there was something different about her, something he couldn't quite put his finger on. While the others trembled, pleaded, or stared blankly into the dirt, she lifted her eyes. And when she did, it was like the world around him paused. He was used to looking down on people. In fact, most men of his wealth and stature did. But this girl, she looked through him, like she was the one deciding his worth, not the other way around. The year was 1829, and the West African coast was alive with trade, noise, and secrets. The kind of secrets that could sink ships or change the fate of nations. He was a merchant, powerful, feared, the type of man whose name echoed in courtrooms and back alleys alike. He didn't need a slave. Not really. He had plenty. Dozens. Maybe more. But something about her, something in that quiet fire burning behind her eyes, felt dangerous. And he was a man who liked danger. "She'll break easily," the auctioneer muttered, brushing a hand across the girl's shoulder like she was furniture. "Hasn't spoken much since she was caught. Could be mute. Or just stupid." The merchant raised an eyebrow. Mute? She didn't look mute, and she sure as hell didn't look stupid. 20 silver pieces, he said flatly. Sold. The deal was done in seconds. The chains came off. And just like that, a living mystery was dropped into his world. She didn't flinch, didn't thank him, didn't even look his way. She simply walked ahead of him, with her head high and her back straighter than any slave he'd ever seen. And that's when it began. The unraveling. He brought her to his estate, vast, elegant, and intimidating, just like him. A place where servants rarely spoke unless spoken to, and no one disobeyed twice. But this girl? She didn't follow the rules. Day 1, she refused to wear the servant's uniform. Day 2, she refused to eat on the floor like the others. Day 3, she corrected him. Him, on the pronunciation of an ancient proverb. A proverb he thought he'd mastered after years of travel. At first he was amused, then annoyed, then curious. She wasn't like the others. Not in how she moved, not in how she spoke, not even in how she breathed. At night, when she thought no one was watching, she sat by the window and hummed songs in a language he couldn't place. Her hands traced invisible patterns on the floor. Rituals, maybe, or memories. And when he listened closely, he swore he could hear names. Royal names. Names that echoed of lineage and bloodlines. But she said nothing. Never offered explanations. Never asked questions. She simply existed in his home like a silent storm cloud. Ready to strike, but patient enough to wait for the perfect moment. The other servants whispered, "She doesn't walk. She glides." I saw her fix the master's bookshelves. With one hand. I heard she speaks 7 languages. The merchant dismissed their gossip, or tried to. But even he couldn't ignore the way she stared at the stars like they were sending her messages, or the way she treated his children, not as a slave desperate for favor, but as a mother would, a queen even. Then came the day he made the mistake of touching her. It wasn't harsh, it wasn't cruel, just a casual, thoughtless gesture. A hand on her shoulder to get her attention. In an instant, she spun around, eyes blazing. And though she said nothing, the warning in her gaze could have stopped a lion mid-charge. She may have been in chains once, but she was no one's property. That's when he realized he hadn't bought a servant. He'd bought a secret. Weeks passed. He started observing her more closely, almost obsessively, like a scholar dissecting a sacred text. One morning, he found her in the library, yes, his private library, reading a book in a language even he couldn't understand. And when he asked where she'd learned it, she gave him a half-smile, just a flicker, and said, "I've always known." That smile haunted him for days. It wasn't arrogant. It wasn't flirtatious. It was sovereign. Then there was the necklace. He discovered it while she was bathing by the garden pool, unaware he was nearby. A thin gold chain tucked beneath her tattered dress, bearing an emblem, intricate, regal, unmistakably royal. It glinted in the sun like it had been forged by kings. He confronted her, finally. He couldn't hold back any longer. "Who are you?" She didn't answer. He tried again. "You're not a slave." "Not really. So tell me, who did I bring into my house?" She looked at him, and for the first time, her eyes softened. "I am no one," she whispered. Which, of course, meant she was someone. The next morning, a letter arrived from a Portuguese trader, a man who owed the merchant a favor. Inside were words that made his blood run cold. "The girl you purchased resembles the missing daughter of King Coro of the Zombola Kingdom. She was taken during a rebel raid 3 years ago, presumed dead. But her markings, her dialect, her name, it all lines up. If this is true, you may be housing royalty, or worse, a symbol of revolution." Royalty. He'd bought royalty. No wonder she wouldn't bow. No wonder she refused orders, slept like a queen, spoke like a scholar. The entire time she had been choosing silence, allowing him to believe she was less than she was. And now he realized he hadn't just underestimated her. He'd endangered her. If word got out, if enemies of her family found her in his home, they'd kill her. And maybe him, too. But it wasn't fear that consumed him. It was respect. And, though he wouldn't admit it, a strange desire to protect her. But protect her from what? The truth? Or the consequences of it? He started noticing everything after that. The way she avoided mirrors, as if seeing herself would make the pain unbearable. The way she listened to conversations about war, trade, and politics like a general planning her next move. The way she sometimes stood still for minutes on end, like she was remembering a world no one else could see. He stopped giving her orders, started asking questions instead. Soft ones, subtle ones. Like, "What does your name mean?" Or, "Have you ever been to the highlands near the river?" And once, just once, in the dark of night, "Do you miss your throne?" She never answered directly, but once, as they passed in the hall, she murmured, "A throne is only wood and gold. What I miss is home." He didn't know what to say, so he just nodded. Because deep down, he knew. He hadn't bought a servant. He hadn't even bought a secret. He'd bought a storm, and it was only just beginning to rain. It started with the necklace, but that was only the beginning. The more he watched her, the more he realized her entire existence was a trail of clues, hiding in plain sight. Her posture, her silence, the way she measured every word before it left her mouth, as though each syllable carried the weight of diplomacy. She never begged, never pleaded, never cried. Not even when others were beaten. Not even when he tested her patience. She had discipline, the kind they drill into royalty before they even learn to walk. One afternoon, as he crossed the marble corridor, he overheard her speaking. Not to a person, but to the house cat. In a language that sounded like a dance. Soft vowels, clicking consonants, like wind brushing over drums. A dialect he couldn't place, but somehow his parrot did. The bird squawked a reply in the same tongue. A tongue he'd never taught it. And just like that, it hit him. She wasn't speaking to the cat. She was remembering, reciting verses. A poem, a prayer, a declaration. Later that evening, he summoned an old friend, a linguist, well-traveled, well-paid, and discreet. He listened for less than 10 minutes before putting down his wine glass and going pale. "That's Zombolan," he whispered. "But not common Zombolan. That's royal court dialect, used only by nobility, warriors, and priests. Most people haven't heard it in decades." The merchant leaned in, heart thudding. "She's quoting the ancient oath of inheritance. That woman, in your house. She's not just a princess. She's the firstborn." The firstborn, the rightful heir. And suddenly, every odd behavior made terrifying sense. She wasn't trying to hide, because she was afraid. She was hiding because she knew the moment her identity was exposed, people would come. Not just rebels, but colonists, traitors, opportunists who would see a lost queen as a bargaining chip. or a threat to be eliminated. The merchant stared into the fire that night, silent. He had bought her like any other object, like livestock. And now? He had a future monarch scrubbing his dishes and sleeping on a mat. He poured himself a drink, a strong one, and for the first time in years, he didn't feel powerful. He felt small. The next day, he tried to act normal, tried not to let the weight of what he knew bleed into his eyes. But she noticed. Of course she did. Royalty can smell when secrets shift. So she confronted him. Not with words, not with drama. Just a quiet moment in the library. She slid a book off the shelf, turned to him, and said, "I assume your friend told you." No denial, no games, just that calm, terrifying grace that only true leaders possess. He cleared his throat. You could have told me." She raised an eyebrow. "And would that have made me free?" He said nothing. She stepped closer. "You bought a body, but I am not just a body." He looked into her eyes, and for the first time since he'd known her, he didn't see anger, or even pride. He saw grief. "You were taken," he said softly. "They came in the night," she replied, "with chains, guns. They killed my guards, burned the temple. I remember the scent of smoke in my hair. I remember the weight of blood on my ankles. And I remember screaming in a language none of them understood." He swallowed hard. "What do you want from me?" She paused. "Nothing. I want from you what you cannot give. My crown, my people, my mother's voice, my kingdom's drums." Her voice broke, just once, barely a tremble. But it cracked him open like lightning splitting stone. He did something then that surprised even him. He bowed. Not low, not groveling, but enough. A gesture, not of guilt, but of recognition. She blinked, slightly stunned. "I'm sorry," he said, "for what I did, and what I didn't know." She nodded once. "Then let's begin." "Begin what?" he asked. "Justice." The redemption arc didn't start with a grand apology, or some tearful act of self-sacrifice. No, it started with quiet revolutions, small decisions. He stopped calling her by the name on the slave ledger. He asked what her real name was. "Zaria," she said, "daughter of King Koro, born beneath the fire moon, blessed by the oracle of Inkasi." He repeated it, slowly, as if memorizing scripture. Then he went further. He gave her a room, not a servant's quarters, but one of the guest chambers. Silk bedding, fresh fruit, her own books. The staff murmured. Rumors swirled. But he didn't care. He sent word through the underground network. Trusted traders, loyal rebels, old allies of the Zombola kingdom. He asked questions, demanded answers. He wanted to know if her people still lived, if the royal bloodline had survived, if there was still a throne to reclaim. And what he learned stunned him. The Zombola kingdom had fractured. Rebellion, colonization, infighting. But deep in the eastern highlands, a faction remained. Loyalists, warriors, a secret camp that still lit bonfires for Princess Zaria, hoping, praying she was alive. He told her everything. She didn't cry. She simply stood, back straight, and said, "Then we go. I go." He blinked. "Now?" "I've waited long enough," she replied. "If they are still fighting for me, then I must fight for them." He knew it was madness, dangerous, possibly suicidal. But he also knew there was no stopping her. So he helped. He sold part of his estate, bought passage on a hidden trade route, smuggled her through checkpoints disguised as a merchant's niece, traveled alongside her, not as master and servant, but as equals, as allies. One night, as they camped under the stars, she asked him, "Why are you doing this?" He shrugged. "Because I owe you, and because..." She looked up. "Because I want to see what happens when the world sees you for what you are." She smiled, not like a servant, not like a princess, but like someone who had finally remembered their name, They reached the highlands after 3 weeks, dust-covered, bone-tired, but alive. And when the warriors saw her, scarred, radiant, proud, they dropped to their knees. One whispered, "She returned. The lioness has returned." She was back, not as a child, not as a victim, but as Zarya, princess, leader, queen in waiting. He stayed long enough to see her step onto the makeshift platform and address her people. Her voice rang like thunder. Her words burned like fire. She spoke of survival, of revenge, of rebuilding, of legacy. And then, when the crowd roared, she turned her gaze to the man who had once chained her wrists, and now stood silently in the shadows. She raised a hand. "Let it be known," she declared, "this man, once blind, now awakened, helped return a daughter to her people. He is no master. He is no owner. He is a witness. And he is honored." They bowed to him. And for once, he didn't feel ashamed. He felt reborn. Before we dive into the final act of this wild, powerful journey, hit that subscribe button if you haven't already. Comment below what you would have done if you discovered your so-called servant was actually a royal heir. All right, now buckle up. This is where it all comes together. She didn't walk back into her homeland with trumpets or golden chariots. She walked in with calloused feet, a cloak of dust, and a spine forged in fire. Zarya was no longer the soft-voiced girl hiding behind silence. She had become something else. Something the world had forgotten how to name. In the weeks that followed her return to the highlands, Zarya didn't demand a crown. She earned it. She rebuilt what remained of her kingdom not with gold or conquest, but with strategy, diplomacy, ruthless compassion. She spoke to rebel leaders, sat with village elders, held the hands of orphans who didn't know her name, yet still called her mother. And people followed. Because when a queen walks like thunder, even mountains bow. She created a council, not of nobles, but of minds, farmers, warriors, healers. She even invited her former captor, the merchant, to stay. Not as a guide, not as a lord, but as a man learning to be better. He refused at first, out of shame, out of fear. But she looked him in the eye and said, "You once bought me. Now I ask you, will you stand beside me freely?" So he stayed, and witnessed history. Together, they built schools where slave pens once stood. They turned old battlegrounds into gardens. They took the language of colonizers and turned it into fuel for policy, for reform, for diplomacy. But peace doesn't come without blood. Word spread across borders, into palaces, through trade ships and spy networks. Zarya of Zombola was alive and reclaiming what was stolen. That's when the vultures came circling. A rival faction, backed by a European trading empire, launched an attack under the banner of order. Soldiers marched under flags of peace, while their boots crushed crops and skulls alike. Zarya met them at the border. No armor, no fear, just her voice. She gave them a choice. Turn back, or history will bury you beneath my people's names. They laughed. And that's when the arrows came. Her people fought like ghosts, swift, silent, unrelenting. Zarya led from the front, her blade singing a song older than the kingdom itself. Not because she loved war, but because she remembered. She remembered what it was to be chained, to be silenced, to be sold like cattle. And she vowed never again. When the battle was done, the field fell quiet. Her dress was soaked in the blood of enemies, and yet her crown had never looked brighter. Months later, she stood at the edge of a cliff, overlooking her kingdom, rebuilt, reawakened. Children played in the river where colonizers once washed blood from their boots. Elders told stories that had once been forbidden. Women who'd been taken now led armies. And Zarya? She didn't wear a tiara. She wore her scars, proudly, a warrior's crown. The merchant, now older, quieter, stood beside her, unsure of what to say. So she said it for him. "You look like a man who wants to ask permission to leave." He nodded. "I've done all I can. This is yours now." She turned to him. "You did what few men ever do. You changed." He chuckled. "Not enough." "Maybe not," she said. "But you tried. That matters." There was a pause. Then she added, "Go. Tell my story. Tell it right." And so he did. He returned to his homeland, not as a wealthy trader, but as a broken man who'd been rebuilt by the very people he once tried to own. He funded abolitionist networks, spoke in town halls, wrote books, not under his name, but under hers. He dedicated his life to making sure no one ever forgot Zaria of Zombola, the girl he bought, who turned out to be a queen. Years passed. Zaria grew older, wiser. Her kingdom flourished. Borders reopened, not for invaders, but for scholars, traders, and exiles seeking peace. Her throne was made not of gold, but of stone, unmovable, etched with the names of her ancestors and the people who died believing in her. And one day, under the same fire moon she was born beneath, she spoke to her daughter. A fierce little thing with sharp eyes and her mother's spine. Zaria told her, "Your blood carries more than power. It carries memory. Never forget what we came from. Never forget who you are." Her daughter asked, "And who are you, Mama?" Zaria smiled, tears in her eyes. "I am the girl they tried to break, who learned she was never just a girl at all. So now, if you ever hear the wind sweeping over the West African plains, listen closely. You might hear the drums, or the hum of an old royal prayer. Or maybe, just maybe, you'll hear the voice of a woman who once lived in chains and rose to rule the world."